So Brad, you were the founder of the Mental Health Pledge. What are you hoping that this thing is going to catalyze?
Co-founder of the
Co-founder,
yeah.
yes.
Naveed's amazing too. This is a little too close to me. There we go. Does this sound normal? Yeah, so co-founded the Pledge with Naveed during the SVB sort of banking crisis. I guess in some parts that was a catalyst for starting it. And when we think about like the macro picture for the Pledge, it's how do we drive not just like a fad or a slight little shift, but like a true shift in how startup founders and investors look at founder mental health. And that shift that we'd like to see is we'd like to see it treated as a priority, a business priority.
Well, kudos to you for that, because I am right there with you. Just looking at the data is really staggering around founder mental health. And actually, we've seen from the research, I don't know if any of you have seen this, but the numbers are quite high in terms of predisposition to mental health conditions, such as bipolar disorder, depression, neurodiversities, and startup life just has to exacerbate that, right? So what do you say to maybe VCs who kind of see this pledge as just another way of virtue signaling? Like, okay, the VCs, they're gonna sign this pledge, but what's really actually coming of this? Are there some VCs who are not signing it, or any cynicism about the pledge that you could share more about?
Yeah, I think when I was in venture, I would have looked at something like this with cynicism. And I think you should, because there is so much virtue signaling in VC. And it is one of these things where it's like, oh, like that's cute. It's a nice to have pledge. Of course, we'll sign it. What is no skin off our back? And I think Naveed and I anticipated that sort of initial reaction, which is like, this has no teeth. And that outlook is actually right. You're correct. It did not. And I'd like to think that was an intentional decision to put something out there that people could easily, like low barrier to entry, sort of come around, and with very much the intention of the next iteration is like, how do we give this thing teeth? And so I think that feedback is actually like right. And I think now we're starting to, I'm happy to get into like the mental health clause, which is legalese in the term sheet, and all the folks who have leaned in there. To your question on, or were there initially people who were like, no, like this isn't for me? Yeah, and maybe we can even talk about the flourish sort of back and forth that we had, not, to the extent you're comfortable, of course. But I think you asked about the cynicism around it. It's like, having been in venture, now being a founder, the truth is like, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but like VCs are sheep. Like they follow one another. And so once we got YC and Benchmark and General Catalyst, these sort of like name brand tier one funds to lean in, the rest was history. And there were people like Brad Feld who started Techstars who were just immediate, like, I get it, how do I lean in? He did like a blog post on us, things like that. And so it was awesome to see like an initial spark. And then it was like sort of a slog until we could get the big boys, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. That's super helpful. Yeah, we had some hesitations at Flourish about signing the pledge. We eventually did sign the pledge. And our hesitation was more from this kind of fear of virtue signaling, for instance, that I mentioned before. We believe that, we need to be doing the work and showing up in the way that is, walking the walk. And sometimes a pledge, maybe it just seems like, all right, what's really going to happen with this? And if everybody signs it, but then nobody's doing anything, are we actually going to see systems change? Is everybody here familiar with the Founder Pledge? Hands up if you've heard of it. Okay, so a very small amount. So maybe share a little bit about the Founder Pledge.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, it was Naveed, who I mentioned is the co-creator of the Pledge, and I came together around sort of like a shared understanding that founder mental health is, one, under-discussed, but underappreciated from the general community, but also specifically the investor community. And what we wanted to do is, it wasn't as, sort of polished as on our site, founderpledge.com. But at the time, we started as a Google Doc. It was like, hey, Naveed's all, like, no credit to myself, Naveed is like all about speed. He's like, let's just put it out there and see what happens. And I'm like, no, let's cultivate a 90-day plan. Like, so we put it out, and really it was like this sort of, let's throw spaghetti against the wall until we see what sticks. And what really resonated with people was like, founders want to have sort of a signal as to which investors actually care about this. I have thoughts I think I've shared with you privately, like whether you give a shit or not about the founders themselves, like as humans, as people, I think you have a fiduciary obligation to your limited partners to care about it as a venture capitalist. But the pledge is all about how do we catalyze a community around this? How do we make sure that founder mental health is not treated as this like nice to have, like, yeah, we'll give you 30K and you can spend that on your mental health. Like, they're there. No, treat it like a business expense. The same way you treat legal, the same way you treat accounting, treat it like that. And that's when we'll know, when founders feel empowered to do exactly that, that we've, driven the change that we want to see. And I think Alex put it differently. It was, what was the tagline of this event now? It's like catalyze entrepreneurial.
Building entrepreneurial capacity.
Yes.
That. Build
Capacity.
entrepreneurial capacity. I think is actually very synonymous with what we're trying to do. And we're trying to have investors incentivize that.
Well, I'm happy to share a little bit more about what we've been doing
Please.
at Flourish as well.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll start with a little bit of a kind of step back in my role. I am not a venture capitalist. I work for a venture firm, but I head up human capital. So I work really, really closely with entrepreneurs on building companies and anything related to people, operations. And over the last 15 years in venture, I have found that a lot of times people issues are kind of the Trojan horse for something that is going on much deeper. And so a lot of our internal programming for both our team and for our founders has been around how do you build your own capabilities, building resilience, how do you learn more about self-management, self-development. We teach our investors empathy skills because we know that the power dynamic in the founder-funder relationship is such that it's a natural reaction for your empathy to decrease over time when you're in a position of power. That has been studied. And so we feel like it's really incumbent on us to be showing up in a way that allows our founders to flourish. We call them our flourishing founders. So that's things like, having these retreats, having peer circles, doing the various workshops. But I know you're kind of wondering too about what's the future? What does the future
I would
look
love to not discrediting all that work that you're doing. Yeah. I think it's important and great, and I wish more venture groups would emulate that. But I'm curious, if you could snap your fingers and X emerges, what is X in the context of what we're talking about?
Yeah. So I think what you're getting at is this notion of how do we scale founder well-being? How do we bring that to a broader community of founders, and not just lucky ones who might be part of one portfolio that offers a little extra support and actually cares about this fundamentally as a corporate or as an organizational principle. And there's a few things we're thinking about. So one is, how do we build a community? How do we rally people around this, specifically in the venture world, where that culture has been built and solidified into something that is not healthy, and something that is having a negative impact? How do we sort of take a look at that, take a step back? And I've been so heartened to be in a community of people who are starting to rally around this and really talking about what are some real life solutions that we can do, how we can show up differently. And instead of telling founders, oh, here, do this add this other thing to your plate. Now go to therapy and take some time off and do this. No, actually turning the mirror and looking at ourselves and saying, how do we show up as more empowering advisors, as more caring humans who are going to be there for your journey as a partner. So this looks like building community, doing more research, gathering data. VCs are very data driven, so we try to invest now in research that is capturing what entrepreneurs are saying, what the struggles are. That's really powerful. And another thing that we're looking at, and actually we started doing, we funded some research with a company called Econa and UC Berkeley that is building a diagnostic tool for founder mental health. This will be a 2-year project. It's going to take some time before it gets rolled out, but the idea is that this becomes a public tool that's widely available for any entrepreneur to use to be able to see where there might be potential areas to explore or seek treatment for. So actually we're taking study participants right now. So if there's VCs out there who have communities of entrepreneurs, or maybe with the Conscious Entrepreneur Group, we'll share that QR code so that folks can be part of that survey.
Amazing. I didn't even know you guys were, so Dr. Freeman, Freeman's like the godfather of entrepreneurial mental health. He wrote or conducted a study titled Entrepreneurs Are Touched with Fire. Am I getting that right?
That's right.
Something of that nature. But we were also going to work with, he's on our strategic board, and then we're working with Econa as well. So that's awesome. Could I push a little bit on something you're sharing? You hear this term like community get thrown out a lot, and I think it's relatively ambiguous. I'm curious, like, how do you guys think about community in this context as far as like what you do at Flourish?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And community that I'm looking at right now is the venture community, and specifically individuals who are passionate about founder well-being. And we're at the very early stages of building a community where we're doing listening tours. And we're trying to understand perspectives, because we have one perspective, but we also have a sole LP and an evergreen fund, and there are things that we know not everybody is dealing with. So to understand what is getting in the way. VCs are people too, right? They have their own kind of metrics to meet and people to look up to and what they're supposed to be driving. And we want to get more stories of how we can demonstrate the ROI of care. How we know that being a better supporter, a better backer, a better human enables higher performance of companies. That these aren't mutually exclusive. So community building at this point is more about just sort of learning and understanding, so that we can identify what's the right direction to go with this community.
And have you seen sort of the like, and I run a separate mental health startup, and we call what our first sort of product is like our minimum viable test, or MVT. I feel like you're in MVT stage of what you're doing. Have you started to see like the ROI on that? And what's the feedback loop look like for Flourish and you personally?
Well, I would say that there's some benefit in just talking about it. So just having conversations, blogging, writing about founder well-being and the importance of it is part of what we hope will start to destigmatize the conversation. That it's not that every entrepreneur who soars and does well is just doing it because they are, sleeping under their desk and working 24/7. We have to stop glorifying the hustle culture that Sherelle talked about, that Alex talked about. We know startup life is challenging, and it should be. It's also really rewarding and really empowering and fun and intensely gratifying. But you shouldn't have to lose your relationships. Like what Sherelle was saying, you shouldn't have to lose your friends. You shouldn't have to sacrifice your physical health to be able to build a successful company.
Right. And I'm glad that you said, and it should be challenging. I think some of the feedback we've gotten is that from, I wouldn't say people who aren't open-minded, but people who have sort of a cynical view is like, what's wrong? Like, you guys, they chose to be entrepreneurs, and you're creating this like mushy little like, oh, it's all gonna be okay. No, it's not. It sucks. You're crazy to be an entrepreneur. And it should be, like, you're an insane person to start a company. because of, like, let's look at the statistics around building a company and having it be whatever you deem success. And so I'm glad you said that, because I think some of the feedback is, well, this shouldn't be mushy. Like, let's acknowledge in the pledge, I think I can speak for the team, is like, we're not saying don't hustle, like you have to hustle, but can you hustle responsibly? And that's sort of like our tagline. Yeah.
Amazing. There were a few other things I wanted to share, and I'd love to get your insights too, for this group who, I don't know, who here has an investor, a venture investor? We have a couple. Okay, maybe who's seeking investment? Maybe a few more. Okay. So I think there's always a challenge of how do we, we're showing up as conscious leaders, but our investor is not a conscious investor, and they are not showing up where we are, meeting us where we're at. I think that's really tricky, and I'd be so curious to hear what you have to say about this topic, but a few things that I've talked to our portfolio about, and by the way, because I'm not on the investment team, I am a kind of another person that our founders can talk to who's not sitting on their boards. I'm not responsible for writing checks, so I think that's really helpful too.
That's important, the differentiation between your role and...
Yeah, definitely. But I think there's a lot that you can do. I mean, seeking to understand another person's perspective is always really helpful. And even if it feels like they're the ones in power and they're the ones that are trying to drive their story, you also have a story. And it's important that you keep communicating your story. And I have so many of our founders who say, I go into a board meeting and none of my board members have read the materials, and they're asking me dumb questions that they would have had the answers had they read it, or they're treating me like they're experts even though I'm the expert in my business. And I think you have to own that. You have to lead with your story, and when they keep trying to bring you back into their story, have the confidence and the ability to kind of stand your ground and hold your boundaries too.
I think what's important, like, I couldn't agree more with everything you just shared. I think there's like this spectrum, right? Where it's like, if we take a step back, your investor's on your team. Like, you actually own equity in the same entity, and so we all want this to exist and succeed. But then you have this dynamic, for example, like where the founder feels disconnected from the investor, and it feels like, okay, we're on separate sides of a boardroom table, and I need to win. I think founders should absolutely, pound their fist and be like, I built, like, there is no investor without a founder. There's not. The only reason VCs can exist is because people are crazy enough to go try and build companies. And so I think it's really interesting to think about, like, hey, we're all on the same team here. And from the pledge's point of view, thankfully we don't have to with, amazing funds like Flourish, but how can we actually reorient it on the investor side so that they're not going to that board meeting, having not read the materials, having, pontificating on whatever they think is the right go-to-market strategy. Like, how do we actually sort of tackle it before it happens? What's the word for that? Preventative.
Yeah, definitely. I think we need to raise the bar for what we expect from investors. You should expect to be treated like an equal, like the person you are, and you belong. You absolutely belong.